Okay, so what went wrong? Well, maybe just because you've set things up so there's a junior emperor and a senior emperor in two different regions, and the senior emperor retires, then the junior one takes over, and they install a new junior emperor. Just because you've got this whole thing set up, it doesn't mean people don't want to seize power and be in charge and be very, powerful and things like that. Doesn't mean that people still don't want to take the whole empire over. And in fact, maybe you've just made things worse because now you've got four people in positions of power who wouldn't have been before. So maybe you've just created more people who want to be emperor. So if we look at these different regions here, yeah. So here's a better picture of what that would look like. So we got this region, we got this region. Um, oh yeah, I guess these are all together. And we got this region, we got this region. Um, Yeah, it still seems like people are going to want to control the whole thing. Or, the different parts are more likely to break away. Those are some problems that we could see. But Diocletian wanted it to work, and so he stepped down from power. He was going to retire and let the next guy take over and, show everybody an example of how it was going to work. But unfortunately, it didn't really work out. Even while Diocletian was still alive, the empire just started to fall back into civil war. You had different leaders, Constantius and Maximian, and eventually their sons, Maxentius and Constantine, they become the two opponents in a struggle for power, the Civil War. And like we said before, it ends in Constantine taking over the empire and having to invade Rome and win the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where he famously said it was given a message, "In this sign shall you conquer," some kind of cross or symbol of Jesus. And so Constantine took over the empire. And so now we don't even have the tetrarchy anymore. We don't have those four regions. But interestingly, the idea of the east part of the empire and the west part of the empire and the new sort of semi-capitals that were set up, that's going to continue to be important. And Diocletian died seeing his dream fall apart, which is pretty sad. There's some stories that he may have even killed himself, but most of what is known is that he just retired and had to watch as people couldn't stop fighting. So that didn't work out like he'd hoped. Like we said previously, Constantine, he instituted a lot of big changes. He founded Constantinople in the eastern part of the empire. And this was a sign that things were changing, that Constantine was way more focused on the eastern side than the western side. And he thought that was what was most powerful. And part of his reasoning seems to have been maybe he wanted to deal more with battles with people over here and be closer to the action and defend that side of things. But it meant that he ended up kind of neglecting Rome itself. And so he still officially ruled Rome, but he didn't go there. He didn't hang out. He didn't like to be there. Constantinople is a pretty interesting place. It has really good fortifications, these amazing walls, this harbor set up that they would draw a chain over to let ships go in or out, depending on whether they want to. The currents are very hard for people coming down from the north to come invade them. So that's another factor too. It's a very hard city to invade being on this peninsula here with these really good walls. And so that was a big secret to its success. And it would continue to be a stronghold. Like people, if generation after generation, would find that they could not take over Constantinople no matter how hard they tried. So this is a city that could last. Let's hold on to that thought. But yeah, the East-West split continued, and the emperors in the East, in Constantinople, just sort of started appointing lackeys to rule the West. But eventually, these lackeys started breaking off and trying to have these civil wars. So things just continued to get worse and worse. We had the death of Theodosius, the aggressively Christian emperor, around 395, and this is how things looked at that time. And Rome continued to diminish in importance. Even in the western part of the empire, they made the capital of administration and everything a place called Ravenna up here, not Rome itself. So now the Roman Empire does not really even have that much to do with Rome anymore, which is a pretty big difference. You can still see some pretty spectacular churches that were built in Ravenna from ages ago. And Ravenna, became for a while this important city in history, where Rome just fell into a decline. So that's kind of an interesting factor too. Okay, and like I said, Rome experienced some invasions, or maybe migrations that led to conflicts with the Roman army. And these came from the Goths. Okay, pardon my joke there. But yeah, if this helps you remember the three different groups of people who came in. The Goths, there's a very long story how Goths, the word Goth became associated with black makeup, but I'll save that for another time. But at the time, it was just a name of a people who were Germanic. They were part of, let's see, let's go back here, the northern part of the empire, you know? So it's all sorts of different peoples from up here and from around here coming in and invading. Who may not have actually been that much like our word vandals, someone who vandalizes someone, but that was the name of a people as well. And then we also have the Huns, who are possibly related to the people on the borders of China that they were always fighting, which is why in Mulan they just call them the Huns, rather than the Xiongnu, which would be a little hard to remember. But yeah, probably actually related to the Huns we're going to talk about here. But let's talk about these different incidents in Rome. These were all different tribes of what the Romans called Gauls. Gauls being German/French. The distinction isn't really super clear at this time. These very rough, wild people. So the Romans probably knew the Gauls best from art that had been made during the Hellenistic era when they had previously invaded. They're also related to Celts as well. And this is how the Romans thought of the Gauls as these wild and powerful people. This guy, he's very strong looking, he's naked, and he's just killed himself to avoid being tortured by Romans in this statue. So there's his wound, and there's the knife he used to do it. And then in the similar one, this is called the Ludovisi Gaul, and this is presumed to be his wife. It looks like she has just been killed, and now he's killing himself to avoid falling into capture. So the Romans think of these as very tough and ferocious and noble people. And you can't really see it on the statues, but they would have been tattooed all over and been these fierce wild men with mustaches and things like that, who were half naked most of the time. That's how the Romans thought of these people. And the Goths and the Vandals are kind of related to those. Yeah, there's whole maps you can get into. We don't know really that much about them. All this remains pretty vague because we only really know it from the Roman perspective. We don't know as much about these people, but something to think about is the terms we have for them may just be terms for like large groups of them. They were nomadic, or they were traveling around. They were changing where they were living. And we don't really know what they thought of themselves as much as we'd like to. But we have some names. We try and put them on the map. So you don't have to remember all these, but just know that there was a lot of different groups of people, and some of them came in and messed with Rome. So what? Well, the first thing that happened was the Goths. Goths and Alans entered into Roman territory. And sometimes we talk about the East Goths, the Ostrogoths, and the West Goths, Visigoths, which just means the East Goths and the West Goths. And they did various interactions with different parts of the empire, including the eastern part and the western part. But the story is especially known from the western part. Basically, it seems like Rome had promised to give them a bunch of land, and then they didn't give them that land, and so they started an uprising. You know, they kicked up a fuss, understandably. And the Goths were actually able to defeat the Emperor Valens in battle. And this was a really big deal because this was the first time in hundreds of years that Rome had been defeated in a big way, that Rome didn't get what it wanted. And so that's a bad sign. And from this point onward, the Roman military is not going to be able to get the job done in terms of keeping the structure of the empire intact. So the military is just starting to fight a losing battle. And in 395, like I said, that was one of the first times when the east and west sides of the empire split. Eventually they get back together, but it's pretty scary. And then in 410, the Goths invade again, and the Goths plunder Rome. The Goths successfully invade Rome and like start setting things on fire and stealing treasure and destroying things. You know, this is the first time that Rome has been invaded in 800 years, just about. So Yeah, they have to take down the sign that says "not invaded for 800 years." It's pretty sad and pretty scary. I mean, it's like you thought Rome was invincible. It'd be like our country getting invaded, you know? It would be a pretty big deal. It'd be a shatter to your psyche. But the Goths eventually leave and go do their own thing. But it seems like the Goths were maybe being pushed by the Huns. They were running away from the Huns. So that's not a good sign. Um, the Huns, um, yeah, so this is sort of the area where the Huns seemed to be most active, was in more of the eastern part. They came from the steppes originally, nomads from the steppes, from the sort of Russian part of the world, are going to be a pretty big deal in history because they keep coming along and changing the game, knocking the board over. And we run into a guy named Attila the Hun. You might have heard of him. In the year 444, Attila comes into Rome and basically is shaking them down for money. Like, give us lots of money or we'll come in and burn down Rome. That's pretty terrifying. And he's like right at the border too. He's like right at the door. He could do it. He could make good on his threat. Um, and they nearly take Rome. Good news is that Attila chokes on a chicken bone one day and just dies randomly in his tent. So that works out well for the Romans. But, you know, still pretty freaking scary. It's why he's got such a ferocious reputation, is because Rome was so scared of him. Then in 455, in come the Vandals. And the Vandals come in, and again Rome is taken over. But actually, the Vandals, our word vandalize means to, destroy somebody's property. That may not actually be true of the original Vandals. We used to think that they did, vandalize Rome and smash all their stuff, but we looked at the actual archaeology of it, and it seems like the Goths were way more destructive than the Vandals were. The Vandals didn't really do that much. Now, what the Vandals did do was they took over Africa. So, like I said, when Africa splits from Rome, that's going to be kind of a turning point in history, that we no longer think of Africa as being part of Europe, as being part of European culture, as being associated with that. And the Vandals also take over Spain. So a big chunk of the empire has drifted away, and they're never really going to get it back in the long term. So the empire is falling apart. And then finally, another Goth, an Ostrogoth, kills an emperor who is basically just a puppet at this point. And his name is Romulus Augustulus. And the Western Empire is never really the Roman Empire again. You've still got some things going on in the East, but the Western Empire has fallen apart, and the idea of emperors in Rome, that stops being a thing. And now, guess who rules Rome? It's the Goths, for a while anyway. So that's this guy Odoacer, and yeah, this is his territory now. This is not the Roman Empire. So look at that. The Roman Empire is just gone. The Vandals have this, and the Goths have this. But what's this going on over here? What is this? The Eastern Roman Empire is still around? What the heck is going on with that? That's pretty much what happened, is that, Constantine had made the eastern capital, Constantinople, so important and made that a center of power. It was able to survive and to hold on to its territory, even while everything fell apart over here. And so this is really weird. We now have the Roman Empire without Rome. Because these people think of themselves as Romans. Their culture is very Romans. They love the chariot races and everything like that. But they don't. But they don't speak Latin. They speak Greek. And they believe in They believe in the Eastern Orthodox Church rather than the Roman Catholic Church. But it's a bit complicated. Those two things are still kind of coming to be separate. They aren't separate yet. But they have their own church leaders in Constantinople and whatnot. So these guys have their own culture. And these guys last until the 1400s. They last another 1,000 years. So, Romans exactly, even though they called themselves Romans. So historians have called them the Byzantines, based on the former name of their capital, Byzantium. So these are the Byzantines, who think of themselves as Romans, but kind of have a different thing going on. Okay, we will talk more about that in the next video, and we'll also talk about what it was like to live through all this.